All right, so we're diving into some fascinating stuff today, huh? A whole stack of texts about religious history and interpretation, and we're focusing on the Bible.
Yeah.
Specifically, how Jewish and Christian interpretations, well, sometimes they kind of diverge.
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? You could almost compare it to that whole debate about is that dress blue and black or white and gold? Same source material, but people come to wildly different conclusions.
Totally. And it gets even more interesting when you think about how Christians tend to see the Bible as this, like, unified narrative. But then when they read the Old Testament, it's almost like they've already got Jesus in mind.
Right, exactly. Scholars call that a Christocentric reading. They're looking for those connections to Jesus' life, his teachings, and especially his crucifixion and resurrection.
It's like trying to solve a mystery when you already know who done it, and you're just trying to pick out all the clues the author left along the way.
That's a great way to put it. But then, you shift to the Jewish perspective, and it's like watching a whole different movie, but on the same screen. For Jews, the Old Testament, or as they would say, the Bible, isn't about needing redemption through Jesus.
It's more like a family history, right? A story about God and his chosen people, the Israelites.
Yes, a guidebook for living, a record of their relationship with God. It's got the good times, the bad times, the lessons learned along the way, the whole deal. And that difference, that shift in perspective, it really changes how they see things, even big concepts like salvation.
Okay, so tell me more about that. How does salvation look different through a Jewish lens?
Well, for a lot of Christians, salvation is about getting to heaven, being with God in the afterlife, and accepting Jesus as the Messiah. That's key, right? But for many Jewish people, salvation is more grounded in their historical experience. It's about survival through really tough times, persecution, exile, holding on to their identity against all odds.
Wow, so it's not about escaping to a better world, but finding meaning and purpose right here in the middle of all the struggles.
Exactly. And this difference in how they understand salvation is just one example, really. It shows how those lenses, those different perspectives, completely change how people interpret the same words. And it reminds us how important the historical context is, the cultural background, all of that.
It's a good reminder that there are many layers to these stories, and approaching them with humility, being open to different viewpoints, well, that can lead to some really amazing discoveries.
Okay, so we've laid some groundwork here, but now I'm really curious to dive into some specific examples. Like those passages where Jewish and Christian interpretations really go their separate way.
Oh, for sure. We've got some classic examples lined up. One that comes to mind right away is the suffering servant passages in Isaiah.
Oh, right. Christians often see those as being about Jesus, his suffering and death. Absolutely. Phrases like, he was wounded for our transgressions, or the punishment that brought us peace was upon him. Those resonate really deeply with Christians who see Jesus as making a sacrifice, to atone for humanity's sins.
It's powerful stuff, but I'm guessing the Jewish interpretation is different.
Yeah, it is. See, Christians see a single Messiah taking on the weight of the world's sin. But many Jewish people, they see the suffering servant as representing something else, the collective suffering of the Jewish people across history. It's about their strength in the face of persecution, exile, oppression, all those incredibly difficult experiences.
So, same text, two very different but equally powerful interpretations. It really shows how much context
It
matters.
really does. Speaking of context, another passage that people read in very different ways is that prophecy in Isaiah. A virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Matthew in the New Testament, he uses this to back up the story of Jesus being born of a virgin.
Right, and that's a core belief for Christians about Jesus' divinity.
Exactly. But if you go back to the original setting in Isaiah, well, this prophecy, it was given to King Ahaz at a time when things were really chaotic politically. It was supposed to be reassuring, a sign that God would protect Judah. The woman mentioned there, she was probably just a young woman of that time, maybe even the queen.
So the meaning changes a lot when you look at what was going on back then. It reminds me of that saying, a text without a context is just a pretext.
Huh, that's a good one. It really shows how important it is to understand the original audience, what they were going through, what they were worried about. And it gets even more complex when you look at how that word virgin gets translated.
Oh, how so?
Well, the original Hebrew in Isaiah, the word is alma, and it can mean virgin, but it can also just mean young woman. But Matthew, when he quotes that prophecy, he's using the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, which uses a much more specific word for virgin. So even just the act of translating adds a whole nother layer of interpretation.
It's like a big game of telephone. across languages and centuries, and the meaning subtly changes with every retelling.
Exactly. And that brings us to another example that often gets people fired up, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah, that one has a heavy history. People have used it to condemn homosexuality for a long time.
And that's led to so much pain, so much discrimination. It's awful. But if we really sit with the text, and consider different points of view, a different picture can emerge.
Okay, I'm really interested to hear this. What else could be going on in the story of Sodom?
Many Jewish scholars, and some Christian ones too, they argue that the main sin of Sodom, it wasn't about homosexuality, but about a lack of hospitality and a total disregard for justice and compassion.
Go on.
They'll point to that scene where the angels who visited Lot are almost gang raped. That, to them, is a sign of the city's depravity, their lawlessness. It highlights mob mentality and violating those ancient hospitality customs, which were sacred.
That's a really good point. It becomes less about sex and more about power, violence, a complete lack of basic human decency.
Exactly. And remember that passage in Matthew where Jesus mentioned Sodom? He's warning his disciples, saying that any town that doesn't welcome their message, it'll be worse for them than for Sodom. He doesn't even mention homosexuality. He focuses on their lack of hospitality,
Yeah.
how they reject his disciples.
Wow, that's a totally different takeaway from what I'd always heard. It's amazing how much these interpretations can change how we understand a text and even its ethical implications. So, how do we handle these differences? Are we stuck just talking past each other?
I don't think so. I actually think that recognizing these differences is the first step to a deeper, more nuanced understanding of the Bible.
Mhm.
It's kind of like realizing that a diamond has many sides. Each one reflects the light a little differently.
I love that analogy. So, how do we find that light, so to speak, in all these different interpretations?
I think one key is remembering that how we understand a text, even a sacred one, it's shaped by our own backgrounds, our experiences, what we believe. It's like looking through a stained glass window. The light shines through, but the glass itself affects how we see it.
That makes sense. So instead of trying to prove one side right and the other wrong, maybe it's more about appreciating the different colors and patterns that each perspective shows us.
That's it. And that leads to a big question. If our understanding of a sacred text like the Bible is influenced by who we are, where we come from, what does that say about the nature of truth itself?
Ooh, yeah, that's a big one. Is truth something absolute and unchanging, or is it always seen through the lens of our own experiences individually and as a culture?
That's a question philosophers have been wrestling with forever. And it's a really important one today, with so many different perspectives out there. But before we go down that rabbit hole too far, let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about another fascinating example of how religious interpretations can intersect and sometimes clash the relationship between Christianity and Islam.
So we've talked a lot about how even within the Bible, you get these really different interpretations, between Judaism and Christianity. And now we're bringing Islam into the mix. You mentioned Cannon Gardner and W.A. Eddy. What can their work teach us about this?
Well, Gardner and Eddy, they both spent a lot of time really trying to understand Islam, not as like the opposite of Christianity, but as a system with its own logic, its own beauty. You know what I mean? They said that respecting the genuine faith of Muslims is so important, even if you disagree on certain things.
So even before you get into theological debates, it's about acknowledging that there's something real there, something powerful
Yeah.
in how people live out their faith, whatever form it takes.
Exactly. It's like, I don't know, appreciating a beautiful piece of art, even if you wouldn't hang it in your own house.
Yeah.
Right. And that respect, that's where real dialogue can start. Gardner and Eddy, they felt strongly that just saying, hey, Christianity's better, it's got better rituals, better theology, that wasn't going to work for Muslims.
Right. It's got to be deeper than that.
Yeah. So they suggested something else, focusing on the spirit of Jesus.
Spirit of Jesus. That feels really key. What do they mean by that exactly?
Good question. It's less about believing specific things about Jesus and more about actually living out the values he embodied. Things like radical love, compassion, forgiveness, putting others first. They felt that those qualities, when people actually live them out, that's what makes the strongest case for Christianity.
So less talk, more action.
Exactly. In fact, they even said that Christian communities in places where there are lots of Muslims, they should be known for how welcoming they are,
Yeah.
especially to new converts. Like, imagine if those communities were seen as the most loving, supportive families you could find. That kind of experience, they said, that speaks louder than any theological argument.
It's about creating a space where the message isn't, you have to believe this, but more like, you are welcome here, no matter what.
You got it. And that actually connects back to what we were talking about before, about truth and experience, right? What if encountering a community that really lives by those values of Jesus,
Hmm.
what if that's the most powerful encounter with truth that some people ever have, regardless of what they call it?
That's a really powerful thought. So it seems like there's a theme running through all this, right? Whether we're talking about different interpretations of faith or scripture or whatever, it's about approaching these things and each other with some humility and being willing to see things through different eyes. We might just be surprised at what we find.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We have to remember that how we understand faith, truth, even God, it's all shaped by so many different things. And engaging with those different viewpoints, even when it's hard, even when it challenges us, it can help us understand ourselves and the world so much better.
It's a good reminder that when it comes to faith, there's always something more to learn, more to explore. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. I know I've got a lot to think about.